Hi, hello. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Nick, for inviting me to talk. I'm Tom Whitwell. I do music thing Modular. Just sort of a brief explanation about me. I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not somebody with any kind of real rights or expertise to be doing what I'm doing, which is designing music electronics. One of my first ever jobs was I was the editor of Mixmag, so I spent the sort of late 90s and early 2000s in that sort of world. Then I became assistant editor of the Times newspaper, which was a very different operation, as you can imagine. After doing that for a while, I became what is called an innovation consultant, which involves lots of post-it notes and kind of working with people like the National Grid and The Economist. But for the last sort of year and a half or so, I have been in my shed in the corner there making electronics, and that is what I do now as a full-time job. And the thing I'm going to talk about today is the Music Thing workshop system, which is, there's one of them in front of me here. It's a kind of little standalone, all-in-one DIY kind of modular synth. So it's got a bunch of oscillators and filters and envelopes. It's got a computer on the left-hand side, which you can just see behind me there. I'm not going to talk in too much detail about that. Nick said he didn't want all the ins and outs of what everything does. But I'm going to talk about the design process of how I kind of make decisions, how I decide what's going to go in, what isn't going to go in. I'm going to try and share that process as best I can. And I'm not a real product designer, just as I'm not a real electronics engineer. But when you're designing things, there's a kind of world of the decisions you can make. So if you're designing a chair, and I have never designed a chair, but you've got a kind of, they have to be pretty chairy. They have to have somewhere for you to put your bum, somewhere to put your back, maybe arms, something that lifts you off the floor in some way. There is a white plastic chair behind there, but it's a bit bleached out. You can't see it. It's a kind of fairly limited space that you can work in. Musical instruments, I think, are very different. So here are two musical instruments. Here is a cello, and on this side there is a Kiat Lombard plum butter, which is a type of drum machine. And they're both definitely musical instruments. They both kind of, but they're obviously quite different in lots of ways. They represent very different answers to the same question, which is, how does a human kind of control and make sounds? They've obviously got very, very different interfaces. They're very, very different technologies. One of them's acoustic, one of them is very much not acoustic. And they've got very different kind of cultural contexts, I suppose, around them. At the same time, there's quite a lot in common between them. So they are both made of wood. They're both made by craftspeople in small numbers. They're not made in enormous factories. These ones are made in a little workshop in Berlin. This one, I'm not sure where the cello came from. They're both quite expensive. They both have unlabeled controls in it. If you ever tried to play a violin, there's no notes to say, no signs to say what note's going to come in. You have to play it by ear rather than by eye. And because of that, they both require quite a sort of virtuoso approach. You can't just pick it up and make sound with it from nowhere. So there's kind of a lot of similarities and a lot of differences, but they are both definitely musical instruments. The same is true here. You've got, on the left, you've got probably one of the least successful musical instruments ever made. This is called a Buchler music easel, designed by Don Buchler in the early 70s. It's a kind of analog synthesizer with a keyboard. And it was unsuccessful because he sold, I think, about 14 of them. About 14 of them were ever made and ever sold. More recently, they've been kind of rediscovered and cloned and copied, so you can buy them now. But the original ones, there were very, very few of them made. And I think that's because it was a very weird, esoteric thing. When you use it, you can kind of hear the voice of the designer very loudly when you're using it. He's got a sense of what it should do and what it shouldn't do, and he's built all that into the device. So it's very kind of personal and esoteric. On the other side is a laptop, which I think is certainly the most successful musical instrument of the last 100 years, and that would include, electric guitars, all synthesizers, samplers, drum machines. I think the laptop's been more successful in terms of an audience, a number of people using it, than any of them. And it's obviously completely open. The voice of the kind of hardware designer is very, very quiet when you're using a laptop, because it can be recreating like a 70s recording studio with tape machines and old effects, or it can be the wildest, most experimental kind of live coding, or you can be checking Instagram on it. It can do all those things, and the designer is kind of not present and not loud within it. And there's a question there about which is the simple one, which is the complicated one. That comes up again. This is my sort of world. The thing I started designing for was synthesizer modules in kind of Eurorack. Here are two of them. The one on this side is a thing called a monome teletype. It's got 17 sockets that are kind of barely labeled. It's got a screen. It's got an input. So you plug in a keyboard, not a piano keyboard, but a typewriter, kind of QWERTY keyboard. It has its own programming language that you have to learn to be able to use it to make sense of it. And on the right is one that I designed. It's 4 knobs. You turn them up and they're more, you turn them down and they're less. So these are both kind of devices. They're the same size, they're in the same system. One is extremely complicated, one is extremely simple. But they both require a bit of that kind of, there's still a virtuoso thing in them a bit. On the one on the left, you have to learn to program it, you have to learn to do all that. The one on the right, you have a bit of performance and gestures, and you have to put something of yourself into it when you're playing it, I guess. Final example of that, on the left, Sono, which is an AI music generation system. The company's worth $500 million. They're being sued by everyone for copyright infringements, understandably. Their founder said, it's not really enjoyable to make music now. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of practice. You have to get really good at an instrument to do it. So that's one view of what music should be. On the other side, a pair of claves. If you look on YouTube, there's a brilliant video by a guy called John Santos, which explains just how kind of complicated these are to play, how you kind of hold them in your hand to get the right sound out of it, and the impact and the kind of cultural impact they have. So you've got kind of technically complicated, but very easy to use. You just type in whatever you want. It produces some terrible version of music. Technically simple. These are literally 2 sticks. But I think if you asked me to play claves with any kind of serious musicians, I could definitely not do it. So the conclusion of this bit is the space of all the ideas for musical instruments is incredibly kind of broad and wide, particularly with something compared to like a chair. So that means when you're designing something like this, you have this enormous range of decisions you're trying to make. I'll just explain a bit about how this thing came about. So about 8 years ago, I wrote this article. I used this is literally a school lunchbox with a little kind of modular synth that I put inside it. Used that system to make an album in an evening. I wrote a computer program to generate some sort of text scores, some descriptions. I then followed those instructions, recorded what had come out, and put it on SoundCloud, which, if that counts, that's making an album. And about 7 years later, I got an email from this guy who teaches at Falmouth University saying, would you like to come to Cornwall and run a course for a dozen people talking about graphic scores, talking about modular synths, talking about field recording, that sort of thing. And I said, yes, of course, I'd like to do that. I met the guy in this nice pub in Falmouth, started to plan the event, and we started kind of imagining, looking forward to the event and thinking, we're going to have these people, we're going to be in this big house, but what are they going to use? What are they going to be using to kind of make sound? What's the idea going to be? And so this kind of mysterious white box in the middle where we didn't know quite what was going to go there. I started thinking, well, I could design a thing that people could use for this. That evening, I started making a list of the kind of ideas of what I wanted something to be, the kind of things I thought people might want to do with it, the kind of things I was personally interested in. I started sketching it in InDesign, I guess, and you can see straight away, start to get a sense of the sort of things I might be able to do. And this is a mixture of the things I've got the skills to do and that I want to do or think I can learn to do. Then start the kind of electronics process of designing the thing. This thing at the bottom is called a breadboard. You kind of stuff the components into it and can make circuits without sort of soldering or putting anything together. So you can test them. I can plug like a sequencer into it and get it to do something. This is that building part of the kind of envelope system in there. So there's a lot of sort of prototyping, trying to see what works, sort of proof of concept stuff. There's a thing I'll talk about in a moment where you put little program cards into the machine to make it do different things. This was the sort of bodged together version to see if that would work. A lot of this sort of thing, which is kind of simulating things. Also a lot of going out, meeting people I know, talking to them, listening to how they understand the thing. When James was looking at this, it was a very early stage, so this is what he was actually looking at. It was a kind of picture of what if it was like this? What does that mean? Seeing what sense he could make of it. I started recruiting people who could write code, because I'm not very good at writing code, to start designing sort of apps, I suppose, for this. There's a lot of this sort of thing, just really complicated, me trying to figure out, with my very limited kind of maths and engineering understanding, what is this supposed to do, how's it supposed to work? If I look back at this after kind of 2 weeks, I can't make much sense of it at all, but at the time it really made sense. You get to designing the actual circuit boards. All of these blue and red lines have to be drawn essentially by hand. You have to kind of knit the whole thing together, make all the connections, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. Generally, you make a mistake, and the way you arrange these lines can make a difference to what it sounds like or how it works. So when I go on Instagram and post a pitch like this saying, oh, this is my design process, it's completely untrue. That's not what it's like at all. So coming back to the sort of decisions, I think there's a sort of temptation when you're doing anything like this to think almost like an engineer and to think, well, what can it do? What are the most features that you can add? What are the most, so that you can imagine a sort of sheet of all the things it can do. How long can you make that sheet? It's very tempting to think in that way. And some people, if you're saying, should we do this or should we not, the answer is always yes. You're like, I'm not sure whether it should have one neck or two necks, or maybe it can have three necks. Should it have one kick drum or two kick drums? Maybe it could have four. Or could you create a kind of interface that has every single possible switch and knob and button and light and socket that you can possibly squeeze into a space, and you end up with something like that? I think for me, it's always trying to be a bit more thoughtful about the way you're doing it. I loved this. This is from James Holden, who's here tomorrow, who designed this piece of software called Benny. And I thought this was just such a wonderful kind of piece, as I said, of the voice of the designer saying, you're not allowed to just make 120 ppm things, or you can make 120 ppm things if you want to, but you have to do it deliberately. You can't just kind of relax into it. So I thought that was a really nice example of a designer making kind of conscious decisions and working out how to make the thing what he wants it to be. So some of the decisions that I did while designing this thing, I kind of grew up in an era of video games with cartridges in them. So you had N64s and you had Game Boys. I'm also just about old enough to remember a time when computers had little keys in the front of them. And I guess the kind of administrator would hand out the keys to decide who was allowed to use the computer and who wasn't. And I kind of liked both those ideas and ended up in the bottom corner is this computer module that runs off these little tiny program cards that are just like the old Nintendo cartridges. You plug it in and it becomes something completely different. But also the way to arrange those most neatly is on a key ring. So that kind of reference back to that idea, I suppose, is where that came from. Similarly, I was just about old enough to remember when the first Walkman came out. I never had one of these, but one of the curious things about the original Sony Walkman was that it had 2 headphone sockets because it was supposed to be a social thing. You weren't supposed to be isolated in your own world with your headphones. You were supposed to be listening with a friend. And I always liked that idea. So this also has 2 headphone sockets, so you can listen with somebody else. Another example of the kind of, I suppose, trying to be conscious or trying to, I mean, in some ways, this is just me being opinionated. When I was designing that computer module, which is on the left there, there's a real sort of temptation to say, well, it's a computer, I can put in a screen. And screens are kind of fun, you can have little pictures on them. And then you might have those little endless kind of encoder pots. And you can start putting menus in, you can have loads of options, you can do lots of different things with it. That makes sense, people like that. It's probably easier to sell something like that. But for me, that isn't something I like. I want a simple, big control that you can grab hold of, that you can use. Again, that sort of gestural idea. So I didn't do screens and little encoders. I did a big knob and a switch and a couple of little pots. And definitely people look at it and like, oh, it would be great if I had a screen. I'm like, that's a different thing. That's not the thing I wanted it to be. Similarly, in a kind of, away from the kind of computer world, when you're designing an oscillator, so an oscillator is one of the main sources of the sound in the thing, there's actually a load of things you can add to an oscillator that are quite easy. There's a feature called sync, which if you're in analog synthesizer world, you will have devices that have this little sync button on it. And like me, you probably have never really worked out what it's for or what it's supposed to do. Basically makes one really cool sound, but that's about it. But it's very easy to add. You just need a socket and maybe a transistor. Similarly, there's a sound called PWM, which is a cool sound. It makes synthesizers sound sort of big and fat, but it requires quite a few things to control it. You need a knob and an input and maybe another knob, this kind of thing. So it's kind of big. But it's very tempting when you're designing to just add these things in, make all the controls a bit smaller and squeeze them in and try and get as much as you can out of it. I tried to go the other way. I tried to say, what are the things that you're going to use every time you pick something up? Not that you'll use once or twice. And put those in and then make everything as simple and as big and as clear as it possibly can be. So that's kind of what I was doing with that. Here's another example. One of the sort of ideas for this system is that it's not to replace stuff you have already, it's to connect to things you already have. So most sort of musicians will have stuff around. You might have, you know, a drum machine or a keyboard, you might have a laptop, you might have some guitar pedals, and I wanted to make something that you could connect to all those things because you've already got them, you might as well carry on using them. So this has a little chunk in the corner down here called Stomp Box, which is kind of an interface to connect pedals into it because, you know, that's a fun, interesting thing to do. And you can feed back those pedals so they sound weirder and more gnarly than they did before. So that's there. But then I thought, what would be really nice is if you make the whole thing self-contained and underneath the panel, you've got a little output so you can plug in your pedals as well there. So it's got a kind of pedal power supply there. So it's that kind of trying to understand what is somebody going to use this for and how can you make it easier for them and more kind of fun for them. So that's kind of what I was going to say in terms of the sort of explaining it. And I'm not sure there's a great deal I can do to really demo. I mean, I can turn it on and make some bloopy noises, but I'm not sure that's terribly useful because it is a modular synth, so it's very kind of large and open, and there's an awful lot of very different things you can do with it. So I thought it might be better now if people have any questions, if people want to talk about it, if people want to ask, to just throw the floor open. I'm looking and wondering if anyone is going to ask any questions now. Does anyone have any questions or any thoughts or anything they'd like to know more about? See people performing with it as an instrument on its own. I think I think it's a really interesting question in that people will often, there's a thing with kind of Eurorack and with people will build these big systems and be very pleased that they've made a completely, they make some big performance just with that. It's possible you can do that with this. I've seen people do that with this, but actually I think of it more as like one instrument in what you're doing, or it might be a kind of hub for other things you're doing. So certainly people can use it live, and people have used it live, but I think that idea of everything has to come from one place, and everything has to be kind of as sort of self-contained as possible is not necessarily the way I kind of intended with this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I sense it's more like an instrument as part of the original.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Is there another question? Hello.
To what degree do you think you were successful in delivering on your design goals?
When I look back at the list, it looks they're kind of ticked off, most of them. I think there's a really fundamental challenge about making something that is very complicated and having people who aren't deep into that world understanding it. And I think that's something I'm really kind of struggling with, and I think one of the things I'm trying to understand is what do you maybe wrap around something like this? So somebody gets a thing like this, and then they get a series of workshops to build confidence in using it, or they get something around that. So that's the kind of thinking I have at the moment. In terms of, does it tick off the things I originally wanted to do? I think it probably does. But I think there's a kind of bigger question of how do you make something that makes sense for musicians rather than people who are fundamentally kind of excited about, really complicated gear. But what did you think? Sorry.
I guess I was wondering the same thing. I mean, there's like a lot of equipment that looks a little bit like this, right? That does similar sorts of things. You presented it in a self-contained box. So in some sense, it looks like a solution, but you've also provided these feeds into it. But I'm looking at this thinking, all right, well then how do you approach this as someone who wants to make music, right? I mean, if you've got a huge Euro rack, right, you know how you approach that. It's a very complicated problem.
Yeah.
So it kind of like leads you in with this idea it's simple. I was kind of interested in to what degree people had used it, had experienced that as a simple device, or whether you'd put a complicated thing in a box and it remained complicated.
So I think one of the things that I found from using it at that event, at the original workshop in Cornwall, is there's an exercise I did. First exercise I did was, I can demonstrate it, possibly. Let's see. So take out all those patch cables, you just put in one patch cable which goes from there to there. So where it's going from here, which is the sine wave output, to here, which is mixer input. And you then have this big knob does the pitch, and this big knob does the volume. And that incredibly simple setup there, which is like a kind of theremin but with sort of Etch-a-Sketch controls, did that as an exercise with a group of people, half of whom had never sort of touched a thing like this before, and said, right, go away for an hour and record a minute's worth of audio with those two controls. And the sort of synth people were like, oh, can I turn up the FM? Can I use this? And I was like, no, just the sine wave, and just the pitch and the volume. And they came back after an hour and played back what they'd done. And obviously everything was quite kind of wobbly, but there was real differences between the different things people had done. And then I said, right, now let's go away for another hour, and you can now multi-track. So they all had like computers or sound interfaces. They were used to recording. And they came back with these minute-long pieces that were just layers of sine waves moving in different ways with the volume, so amplitude moving in different ways. And they were amazing. The variety of the different things people recorded. Some of them were very rhythmic, some of them were kind of chords, some of them were more kind of melodic. And that, for me, was a really interesting experience to see doing something very, very simple. Obviously, you don't need that whole system to do that. But that, as a way of introducing people to something like that, I found quite interesting and seemed to work very well and seemed to help people sort of feel, kind of open up about doing something that was very minimal, that was very different from what they were anticipating, perhaps.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can have one more question? No more questions. Thank you very much.